in our resilience series brought to you by the U.S. Green Building Council, Middle Atlantic and New England regions, in full partnership with our friends and close associates in the Society of American Military Engineers, New York City Post. We are really glad to have you here this afternoon and really appreciate the opportunity to share some thoughts on where we're going with resilience. I'm Erik Backus. I'm a member of the steering committee for this series, and today's topic, as you can see on your stream, is resilience rating systems, better buildings, and better communities. Just a little recap. This series has been a monthly lunch and learn opportunity for the first half of 2021. So far, we've had 3 sessions, one on January 13th, where we focused on risk reducing strategies for schools in post-COVID-19 world. In February on the 10th, we brought you a session on the economic impact of sea level rise and storm surge in the tri-state region, as well as the consequences of a no action scenario, what that looked like economically, especially for the New York metro area. Last month on March 10th, we had an exciting and outstanding twinning of Ryan Kolkler from the VP for Innovation for the International Code Council and the National Community Resilience Alliance. And he spoke to us a little bit about the international efforts and national efforts to rethink the codes in terms of resilience, paired with a partner from New York Planning Department speaking about their resiliency code and what they enacted temporarily after Superstorm Sandy 9 years ago, but now has been codified and made permanent as part of things in New York City. So those 3 sessions were great, and we had a great time there. These sessions will be made, the videos for these will be made publicly available for viewing through the USGBC on a website soon. We'll get information out to you. Please stay tuned for all that. That said, we have 2 more great sessions upcoming. Please be aware of that, and we'll have information at the end here to share with you on how to get into those sessions if you're here today or if you've been in past sessions and you want to be a part of it. On May 12th, the series will continue as we have representatives for the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. We'll be talking about the future of military innovation for resilience, what's up for us in mitigation measures, what's being constructed or planned as funded out of Washington and implemented by the North Atlantic Division and the New York District of the Army Corps of Engineers. On June 9th, we have a last of our Lunch and Learn series, and we'll talk about that. We'll crescendo our set with a session on the science of storm surge risk reduction, a discussion of the world of outer harbor gates as implemented by other countries and here in the U.S. as well, and what a similar solution might look like in the New York harbor. So those are 2 more exciting sessions. Please sign up for those. They'll be great. We'll share more again at the end about how to register for that. And then while these are great opportunities coming up, these lunch and learns, we are thinking of and we have planning and we're developing, and you'll soon see announcements about a one-day event that's going to be happening this fall in late September or early October. The dates are trying to be pinned down right now, where we'll bring all these sessions together with a quick recap and discussion, then talk about response and reactions to these sessions that we've had over the last several months. And then we'll be looking at bouncing forward. And all of us in the resilience community are always thinking about how do we bounce forward so we can improve our resilience. And so we're going to be talking about that and what we can do. So be on the lookout for that. Before we get into the rest of today's session, I want to thank a few key folks. Well, first and foremost are the steering committee itself. I want to thank and recognize this entire team. Suzanne DiGeronimo, who's with us today, as well as Lieutenant Colonel retired Joe Porovecchio, Lieutenant Colonel Ben Wallen, who's at U.S. Military Academy at West Point, Lieutenant Colonel retired Joe Manis, who is the SAME National Lead for Resilience, Mr. Michael Scarano, Ms. Sarah Sawilka, and with USGBC is Ms. Medea Valeri, who is here to help us make sure all the technical things happen, as well as Mr. Gautam Trafalgar, who is here, who is with us from USGBC. So thank you all for your ability to help us make this happen. Just a reminder, if you're on Zoom, hopefully most of you have experienced Zoom. If you're not, be aware there is a chat. I would encourage you to open your chat box now. We're going to be encouraging you to use that chat throughout this. You're going to see things from the panelists in response. We're going to be engaging with you in a discussion. So get that open right now so that you can have the opportunity to take advantage of that. So as discussed, this is a great opportunity in partnership between USGBC and SAME. One of the great things about this partnership is we're leveraging the ability to give you this as a continuing education opportunity. As you see on the screen, this is a registered for credit for AIA for in terms of your architects as a learning unit. It's also registered for professional development hours, 1.5 professional development hours for engineers. And additionally, it is also registered for 1.5 hours for GBCI credit for all your lead accredited professionals out there. So if you're looking to get take advantage of that, please make sure you know that. So just running through the key required slides here. Here's what we're going to be talking about today, and really enjoy having an opportunity to have this discussion with some great panelists. So let's get right into what we're here today. And the first thing we want to talk about, we're talking about resilience. What is it? And what we have here with us are a great set of folks we're going to discuss and chew on different aspects of resilience and what is out there as a set of resources that you can take advantage of as we get going into this. And you know, we are, it's a still emerging field, of course, resilience, but we have some great things going on with that. And there's, you know, the idea is how do we recover from, absorb, manage, mitigate, engage against adverse events, and how do we do that? And so as we get into this today, our panelists are really going to try to describe that in different ways and so on. So let me quickly introduce myself. I'll be your moderator. I am Professor Erik Backus. I am representing both USGBC and SAME, but I'm also a professor at Clarkson University. I'm going to just give you a few points here about what is available from USGBC. As you may know, there are lots of different ways we can start thinking about resilience. USGBC has put out this report not that long ago in 2019 on how you measure resilience, thinking about different aspects of what that is. As you can see, it's not just merely the infrastructure or buildings, but it's a lot more. And we'll get into that in some of our questions today. And with that, USGBC has a set of tools and if you will, rating systems that are available that you can use as possible resources as you start thinking about how you build resilience in your community. There's a RELi rating system, which is emerging, just became part of the USGBC family. It is currently going under some revisions. There's a peer rating system, which is dealing with the grid, power grid. Obviously, it's a huge part of our resilience. There's a Sustainable Sites Initiative, which deals with landscapes and things of that nature that make sure you think about how we make them. And there's resilience piece of that. And of course, we can never not talk about LEAD. And LEAD has got huge parts now with pilot credits for resilience, as well as now evaluations for how we integrate that. And reminder, LEAD is no longer just about buildings. It's also about communities and cities. There's a LEAD for communities and LEAD for cities rating system that also integrate resilience in them. So be aware of that. And those are great tools that are out there. So that's enough about me, and I'm just the moderator. I'm really going to be the one here just asking the questions. What you really want to hear about is from our panelists. And first up is Dr. Nick Rakovich from University of Buffalo. Nick.
Thanks, Erik. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Nick Rakovich. I teach in the Department of Architecture at the University of Buffalo. I'm not going to go through and read everything that's on my title slide here, but I'll just say that I'm an architect and urban planner. And so the work that I do at the University of Buffalo tends to cross over between those two fields. And on the side, I teach building science. So I also play an engineer in some ways with our students, which is dangerous, but that's what they have me teaching. So Erik, if you want to go to the next slide. So just today, just briefly wanted to talk about a couple of different things that have been working on at the University of Buffalo and maybe helpful resources for folks who are on the call. The first is a series of resources that are at the website that's listed there about adapting buildings to a changing climate. And so we were fortunate enough to work with NYSERDA and Amanda Stevens, who will be presenting in a little bit, over the course of several years to try to develop resources to begin to help buildings, especially in New York State, adapt to the changes we plan to see, we expect to see in the next 50 to 100 years. This research was really trying to fill an important gap, which is that most of the climate assessments in the United States actually really don't mention buildings very much, if they mention them at all. And so getting resources out and trying to understand what role buildings play within climate change, not only causing it, but adapting to it, was really the focus of that work. If you go to that website, you can see there are a lot of different reports that are listed there. They're all free tools, but they have things like 26 different climate resilience strategies, talking about what the impacts of climate change have been on the different regions of New York State, giving just kind of general overviews, but also looking at modeling what the impacts of climate change will be on energy performance as we move forward. And that last one, Erik, if you can advance the slide. The last one was actually really important and has been kind of the subject of some follow-up research. We typically use tools like TMY data, typical meteorological year data, to predict the future. Although we talk about climate change as being a broader kind of phenomenon over time. How we actually model that in buildings is really looking at the weather conditions. And as you look across all of the different files that are being pushed by different organizations, they actually have very different predictions of what the future are. And if you look at the left, this shows the differences between some of those different organizations' work in their expectations of heating degree days and cooling degree days. And on the right, what that means in terms of actual passive systems in buildings. So how much glazing we put into the building, how much insulation we might put in, and what kind of things we might expect to work in the future. It's a short plug in some ways also. We're actually presenting a longer presentation on this tomorrow for the New York State Green Building Conference. So if you can attend, we'll certainly talk about this at length. And then the last piece I just wanted to mention, is that recently with the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act in New York State, there's been a lot of discussion about disadvantaged communities and how we begin to engage disadvantaged communities in the process of planning for climate change. I'm proud of the fact that I'm in New York State and that as part of the CLCPA, there is a real focus on disadvantaged communities. And I think it's imperative on us as architects and engineers to make sure that we're engaging with communities and understanding what's going on. Oftentimes folks who live in some of the places that are stressed by climate change or stressed by systemic racism, as like this map shows here in Buffalo, New York, may actually have a lot of the really important solutions that we need to use to move forward. And so engaging with the communities, collaborating, and understanding where we need to go is critical for the broader resilience of all of the communities where we live and work. So I think Erik wanted me to keep it brief. I'll turn it over to Dazzle here and she can present.
Great, thank you, Nick. Hello, everybody. Thank you for being with us. I will take a minute to introduce myself and then I'll talk about the Climate Smart Communities program. I'm originally from Minnesota, and I would say, my experience growing up, honestly, on a bit of a hippie commune for the first couple of years of my life in beautiful northern Minnesota is part of why I am here today and why climate change has been a central part of my work and my concern for all of the beautiful creatures and birds and life that we share this planet. So I do work for the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation. I've been there since 2014. I am based in Albany, working from home still at this point. And I do manage what we call the community engagement section within the Office of Climate Change at DEC. The Office of Climate Change group is quite small, but growing. We are close to 15 people now. So it's a small group, but it is working very hard to implement the Climate Act. Nick, thank you for mentioning the Climate Act. But my group focuses on community level work. Next slide, please. So the New York State Climate Smart Communities program, I coordinate it statewide, and it is a program that focuses on leadership from local governments, and that includes all 4 levels of local governments: cities, towns, villages, and county governments in New York State. And the focus is both on reducing greenhouse gas emissions, or what in the climate change field is often called mitigation, but not hazard mitigation. That's different. That's Karina's world. In this case, we usually are talking about reducing greenhouse gas emissions when we talk about mitigation. And the Climate Smart Communities program also focuses on adaptation to climate change. It is entirely a voluntary leadership recognition program. There's no fees involved. And DEC, the agency I work for, the Department of Environmental Conservation, takes the lead in the program and was a key player in founding and developing the program over time. But there are 6 other state agencies that are part of the program as well. And so the Climate Smart Communities program does include a rating system, and I'll talk about the certification program in a little bit, but it is a comprehensive program that has lots of different aspects to it. And the idea there is to recognize New York State as a big place, lots of different kinds of people, lots of different kinds of ecosystems and cultures across the state and priorities across the state. So it's aimed to be a pretty flexible framework in which people can identify what is most valuable in their communities and act on that. Next slide. So the Climate Smart Communities program, you can see its comprehensive nature in looking at this list. These are the 10 what we call pledge elements that structure the whole program. As you can see, pledge element 7 is specifically focused on resilience on today's topic, but it is covers a lot of different topics, all the way from kind of engaging and educating the public to definitely a major focus on energy use. Next slide. So the program has basically two levels of participation. At the registered level, a municipality passes a formal resolution that includes those 10 pledge elements. So far, since the program was founded in 2009, we have almost 48% of New York State's population that participates in the program. In 2014, we added kind of another layer and a pretty big step of participating by adding and developing the certification program. And at this point, we have 65 communities that are certified. It is the Q2 review period right now. We're in the middle of reviewing a whole set of applications for communities that have done a certain set of actions and documented those actions, recorded their progress, and are going through a process of reviewing those actions. And so under that certification program, there's been over 2,000 actions that have been sort of completed and documented. And later on, if you're interested and you want to check out the website, you can go and look at the certification reports for every single one of those communities, look at the documentation they submitted. There's lots of good examples and models for action there. Next slide. So a little bit more about the certification program, since in one sense it is a resilience rating system, or at least a community rating system. It is organized by those 10 pledge elements. At this point, we have two levels. We have bronze and silver. You need to have 120 points for the bronze level, 30 for silver, and we are currently developing the gold level. The Climate Act actually is part of why we've been holding off on developing the gold level, because it's the Climate Act is such a momentous major piece of legislation in New York State that kind of changes the whole picture. So the gold level is under development in an attempt to take some time to think about the Climate Act and align with it and figure out what does it mean for a community to be participating at that kind of advanced level and contributing to those state level goals. So it's a standard rating system. There are points per action. Each of the action descriptions offers a lot of information. And so even if your community will never get certified and isn't interested in documenting it and taking months to, track all that information and organize it, just for some sense of scale, in order to get to the bronze level, most communities need to finish at least 20 actions, maybe more towards 25, depending on the actions that are chosen. So it is a big jump. But the action descriptions are there on the website for anyone to check out and learn about resources, funding that's associated with certain actions, any kind of sense of the resources involved, timeframes. That information is available to anybody who's interested in participating. I'm noticing a question, and I'll just go ahead and quickly answer this. New York City is not a registered or certified climate smart community. However, New York City has its own very extensive climate change program. So we would welcome their participation as a city, but it is a unique city, unlike any other in the state, as I'm sure you know. The other quick note about the Climate Smart Certification Program is that it's part of a national network. There are other states across the country, at least a dozen or so, a few more that have been recently opened up. In Georgia, for example, there's a new community certification program that's part of this network called the Sustainable States Network. So that's also another great resource for people to look into, excuse me. Next slide. I also wanted to take a quick minute just to acknowledge that the multifaceted Climate Smart Communities Program also has some funding associated with it. The funding is managed specifically by the DEC, by the State Department of Environmental Conservation, by my office. So there's rebates and grants for electric vehicles and electric vehicle charging stations. And we actually also offer grants that are focused on reducing emissions outside of the power sector. So that could mean from food waste, for example, or transportation or refrigerants. And then also there's these matching grants are available for climate adaptation projects. Next slide. So as I've been talking, some of you might be thinking, isn't there another program like this, or doesn't NYSERDA do this? And it's true. New York State is fortunate to have an abundance of support and programs for municipalities to work on clean energy and climate change projects. So Climate Smart Communities Program is distinguished from NYSERDA's Clean Energy Communities Program in that Climate Smart is much broader. It has a little bit heavier emphasis on broad community engagement, and it includes very overtly resilience and adaptation measures. However, the two programs are complementary, and if there are any communities that are focusing on clean energy actions under that NYSERDA program, and they complete those actions and then apply for Climate Smart certification, they can get points and credit for completing those actions. So we've worked on aligning and making the programs as complementary as possible. And the Clean Energy Communities Program is critical because there are regional coordinators available to every single New York State municipality if they're interested. Those coordinators can help them with these programs and can assist with Climate Smart certification as well. So that's it for me. We'll have lots more time to talk later. And I believe Corrina is, oh, no, it's Amanda Stevens is next, my colleague from NYSERDA. Thank you.
Thanks, Dazzle. Thanks for having me this afternoon, and thanks for joining us. So I'm a project manager in the environmental research program here at NYSERDA, and our program supports research with the goal of providing the scientific foundation for energy and environmental policy here in New York and beyond sometimes. That ranges from, mercury deposition to acid rain, air quality and health, and then climate change impacts. And from my part of the program, that's what I focus on. I manage our climate impacts and adaptation research projects. Next slide, please. So we've supported numerous projects over the years. I'm just going to briefly mention a few of them here that may be of interest, just to give you kind of a sense of what's available. These are all links, so we can make these available to you, so you can go, poke around on your own and see if anything is useful to you. But I'll just go through these quickly. First off is the statewide climate assessment. ClimeAid was what we called our first assessment, and that was released probably about 10 years ago now. It developed climate projections specific for the state, so things like average temperature, extreme temperature and precipitation, sea level rise, that sort of thing, downscaled specifically for New York State. And then we also looked at the impacts of those changes on different aspects of New York. So agriculture, transportation infrastructure, all of those different things. And then we also took a look at potential strategies for responding and adapting to those impacts. So the current information is available at this link, but I will also mention that we're currently starting our new assessment, which will be based on the new science models and information that's out there. And I will put a plug in that we are looking for participants, both to develop and write the technical chapters, or just to advise the working groups and give us your kind of experience and input. We're looking for diverse people, diverse perspectives, all sorts of things there. So we didn't have the information available when these slides were put together. We actually just released this call for experts last week. But I will actually put the link to where you can find more information and apply in the chat box momentarily. Moving on, adapting buildings for a changing climate. Not going to go into that in detail because Nick did talk about that earlier. But you can find another link to it here if you want to go to it there. Next one is something called Idf Curves. And this is a site that provides data and graphs for what are called intensity, duration, and frequency curves. If you're not familiar with them, they provide information sort of on the probability of intense precipitation events. Some of you may be very familiar with them. They're often used by transportation engineers and others, but they hadn't actually been updated for decades when we started doing this project. So these new curves give information based on current climate conditions and also then project what those curves might look like under future climate conditions. So this might be helpful if you're interested in designing, architecture that depends on what those intense storms might be. Next is the Climate Change Science Clearinghouse. And this is really, we meant it to be a repository for kind of all things climate data specific to New York State. So it doesn't really, there's not much information that's developed new by this project or by this site, but it provides links to information that's been developed by others. So it brings it all together in one place, so you don't have to go searching around from site to site to find what you're looking for. So there's lots of information on different documents, just data resources, mapping resources, and there is a lot of information here. Sometimes it can be a little difficult to sort through, but there is a really powerful search function that can help you narrow things down a little bit. There's a very basic GIS mapping function on here that has some of the what some of the stakeholders have told us are their kind of high priority data layers. So you can look at some of the information on a simple map there, but it's not meant to be a comprehensive GIS mapper, but it can give you an idea of certain things depending on what you're looking for. So I definitely encourage you to go check that out and see if there's anything there that's of interest. Next is the Hudson River Future Flood Mapper. This maps future sea level rise along the tidal portion of the Hudson. So that goes all the way up to the dam at Troy, New York. It offers multiple emission scenarios, multiple time perspectives. It also overlays critical infrastructure and damage estimates. So this is actually quite a comprehensive sea level rise mapping system, but it is only focused specifically on that portion of the Hudson. And last one I'll mention right now is the New York State Heat Vulnerability Index. We worked with the Department of Health to develop a social vulnerability index that's focused on those vulnerable to extreme heat. So it maps out areas of the state with populations that are particularly vulnerable to hot weather and heat waves. And this can maybe help prioritize areas of concern that you might want to focus on if heat is something that you're looking for strategies. So I think that's all I had at the moment. Just wanted to give you a quick rundown of some of the things we've got. And I'll turn it over to, I think, Karina is next.
Thanks, Amanda. Hi, everyone. I'm Karina Cavallo. I'm the Deputy Chief of Hazard Mitigation with the New York State Division of Homeland Security and Emergency Services. I don't have a slide about this, which I'm realizing now I probably could have included, but we administer FEMA's hazard mitigation funding. So that includes post-disaster mitigation funding through the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program. And that is currently, we will be announcing actually a round of that funding in the very near future, in the next week or so. And then we also administer 2 annual nationally competitive grants that are intended to be pre-disaster mitigation funding called BRIC, Building Resilient Infrastructure in Communities, and then also the Flood Mitigation Assistance Program. And that all works through the local municipality as the applicant. So just wanted to mention that those are funding opportunities for risk reduction implementation. And what I'm going to be talking today mostly about is the kind of foundation for which we hope the implementation measures are built on, and that is mitigation planning. You can go to the next slide. So mitigation plans are a requirement in order to receive any funding for actual mitigation implementation. So New York State has a New York State statewide mitigation plan, and every community in New York State, if they're seeking funding for projects, must have a FEMA approved hazard mitigation plan. If you're at all familiar with these, then you probably know that historically these have been really large, kind of massive documents that contain a lot of information but aren't that useful, largely sit on the shelf. And so in 2018, New York State transitioned our New York State hazard mitigation plan to a web-based plan. And we've also been piloting this effort with turning this, creating this web-based platform for local planning in counties across New York State. And we partnered with the University at Albany to do that. They're under the Research Foundation, under the State University of New York. And we created this website that is dynamic and can document a lot of the processes and requirements of hazard mitigation plans, and can also visualize a lot of the data that is nationally available, state or available statewide, that can really save the effort on the part of the community from gathering that information or paying a consultant to gather that information and visualize it when it's largely available in these data sets. So that's the purpose of these planning tools, kind of the front end. What I'd like to show you today is one specific tool that will be available, is currently available to those pilot counties, and will be available statewide to communities looking to further assess their risk, specifically to built assets. And that is what we're calling at this moment the scenario tool and asset inventory. You can move on to the next slide. And what you're looking at here, this is Sullivan County. So the map that you see is Sullivan County, with the green portions are all of the built assets. So any building structure that is overlapping with FEMA's regulatory floodplain. And on the table that you're seeing, these are those same assets listed out by land use. We also have by owner type, and we can also search by address, showing where the where they overlap and where the risk is for built assets. Next slide. As we zoom in a little further, you can see that indicator, that little portion on the top of Sullivan County is Rockland, is the town of Rockland. And what this legend does for you on the side is identify exactly how much, what the dollar value is for replacement and expected dollar value of what the potential loss could be in the event of a 1% chance annual flood. And as we zoom closer in, each of these buildings becomes more defined, and we're looking at the actual parcel itself. Next slide, please. From there, you can click on any one of these individual buildings, and we have every building in New York State mapped, although the counties that we haven't worked with, and even those that we have, I imagine there are some cleanups that will always need to happen, overlaying the footprints with the actual building. But we then have the ability to add attributes into each parcel. And what really is the benefit here is that this is a non-regulatory product. So communities can use this to decide during their planning process, where do we have identified risk, either by location or by type of building, right? Schools, you want to evaluate all of the risk of flood. Currently, we only have overlays for our flood zones, but in the future we will overlay with other hazards as well, and other hazard data. And so the idea is here to create this inventory that includes multiple attributes that can then be assessed. And this is really for community use and for planning use. You can go to the next slide. And this is kind of a list of the attributes. I'm not showing any of the attributes that would otherwise be private at this point, but this is the list of the attributes that we're currently allowing for collection. And we can expand this list for other types of building information that might be useful for different types of work and different types of efforts that are looking to assess or make projects available for buildings. And so we can add to this as time goes on, and then we can really integrate this kind of data collection effort and assessment into some of our daily processes. At the state level, we could integrate it with some of our inspection processes. At the community level, they can integrate some of this information with their codes offices. So it's really meant to be a tool that's available for planning, and we are looking forward to kind of rolling this out further statewide. And for those of you, that are interested in learning more about it or getting a more kind of personalized tour through what it can offer, there's a whole suite of information that I've kind of breezed by and haven't touched on today. Be happy to get into more detail in the future. I think that's it for me, and on to Tim.
Okay, thank you. It's a pleasure to be joining you attendees, and particularly honored to be joining my colleagues here on the panel. Rather than read through this, I'll just tell you that I'm a licensed and practicing architect who has spent a lot of effort in balancing a professional practice with active community engagement and volunteerism. And much of what you see on the slide here was inspired by the effects of Superstorm Sandy, which I consider to be my personal wake-up call in disaster response and mitigation. And what I found over the years is that all the volunteer efforts help to support, inform one another, but also ultimately educate myself, my firm, my staff on helping to build a resilient New York. So that's my pitch for volunteerism today. Next slide. The primary volunteer commitment I've made for this year is Disaster Assistance Coordinator for the New York State organization of the American Institute of Architects. This is a position created just a number of years ago, maybe about 4 years ago. And the first person to hold that position was Ilya Azaroff in New York State. Many states around the country if they don't already have this position in the AIA, are creating this position now, helping to make the organization on every tier resilient and participating on many levels in mitigation and so on. You see the different responsibilities that the position holds. The one that I've spent probably the most time on, and I'll just give you a little bit of background on it over the years, is getting Good Samaritan protection, liability protection for design professionals. And really briefly, why that's important is that after a disaster, to call in design professionals as volunteers, they have to have some form of liability protection. When Superstorm Sandy hit the East Coast, 26 states in the country had that protection for their design professionals. Since then, we're up to about 39 states. New York State still does not have it. It's a very long story that I won't bore you with, which basically ends up at the state assembly chamber for us. But and you can learn an awful lot more about that effort easily by going to any of the websites that will show you for AIA New York State, the national organization, and so on. Let's just jump to the next slide. And this is a little bit of background on what we're trying to do as an organization. Cal-OES, California Governor's Office of Emergency Services, is the premier recognized organization for certifying design professionals, code officials to do post-disaster building safety assessments. That's the green, yellow, red placards that you see on buildings after a disaster. So there is a certified program for the people who should be putting those up. It doesn't always happen that way. But when design professionals are doing that work as a volunteer, they need some form of protection, and they need this certification. Right next to that, you'll see the CEDAR program, Code Enforcement Disaster Assistance Response. That's New York State Department of State, and in particular, Erik Bradshaw, who runs that department of code enforcement. That is the way that a New York State licensed design professional is able to volunteer in their own state. They basically are part of a response team through CEDAR that provides them with all the liability protection that they would need. They basically are an employee of the state. I won't mine that down too much further, but it's I just want to introduce this to you, that after a disaster, you see those placards up. How did they get there? Somebody has to put them there. Somebody has to be trained to do it, certified to do it, and they have to be protected themselves going out and doing that type of work. And this is the way that New York State has figured out to do it without that critical liability protection for its design professionals. And last slide. So Disaster Assistance Handbook. In the pandemic that we're currently in, AIA New York State, AIA New York, which is here in the city, joined and created a unified task force. And an extension of that unified task force is the development of a first ever disaster assistance handbook from the AIA here in New York State. Just as many state organizations around the country are creating a position for a disaster coordinator, they are engaging in this exercise of developing a disaster assistance handbook. You know, one of the big challenges here, of course, is, take the pandemic, for instance, how do we develop a disaster assistance handbook for something that doesn't have the tangible qualities that we're used to in many disasters? And so I'm joined in this effort by quite a number of colleagues, architects, engineers, and other related professionals in working together in a task group to develop this book. And we see it as something that'll be forever a flexible document. Never would we be so bold as to say, here's the handbook, that's it, this is good for the next few years. This thing will constantly be being edited and be flexible. our goal is to have this a web document, but also a hard copy document. We'll use it for advocacy, and essentially, besides just the architects and the other professionals that'll be using this book, I see the benefit of this going directly to our clients and the community and the neighborhoods that we're in, and that we develop designs for, and that we work with. So that's essentially my 4 slides.
Well, thank you, Tim, for that, and all the panelists. If the panelists now could turn on their cameras, so we have you all on screen. We're going to get into a panel discussion. We've got some pre-arranged questions, but I want to remind people to put things in the chat. I see people already doing that, or in the Q&A function. That's great. A few have come in about questions. One of the things that all the presenters have done today was graciously said, hey, anything we put in a slide is publicly available, and so we want to make sure you get that information. So the slides will be available after this presentation. You'll get with Medea. We'll get that information to you. Everybody's agreed to that up front. So if you're looking for links and things like that, please be aware of that. So let's first start off with this to the panelists. You all have just provided a ton of great information for community leaders and the average citizen to use and think about resilience. How can we navigate all of this information better to get the right place to start to help build resilience in our communities? And maybe we'll start this off with Dazzle taking a kick at this one.
Sure. Thank you, Eric. So in the way that I see things, it all starts with people. It all starts with people and teams and relationships that are effective and smart and collaborative and committed to making a difference in building resilience. So in my opinion, I think it's important to kind of first look at, where do you want to work? Is it a place that's near where you work? Is it where you live? And kind of look at who's there and who you could potentially partner with. And if we think about the frame of the Climate Smart Communities program, one real basic step is explore the climatesmart.ny.gov website and check, is that town a registered or certified Climate Smart community? And if it's not registered, if it's not participating in the program, that's kind of one step you can take and advocate for passing that pledge. If it is registered or certified and the community has a task force is a great place to volunteer. You know, Tim mentioned the value and the education and the service that can be involved in volunteering, and these task forces in most cases involve unpaid volunteers. And I will say, as a side note, the Climate Smart Communities program tends to be the most helpful for smaller communities. So these, situations could be different, but when I'm speaking about sort of task forces, those task forces for most the towns that participate in Climate Smart Communities program are composed of volunteers. So I suspect that a lot of you are professionals who might have skill sets that would be very valuable to contribute to your community and participate in a lot of these local task forces or various organizations that exist at the local level for building resilience. And there is also, under the Climate Smart Communities program, there is an umbrella kind of broadly over the whole program that involves a series of committees and work groups. And again, if there are some of you are interested in digging into contributing to improving the program and helping it evolve over time, especially the Climate Smart certification program, it involves a long list of over 100 actions, and those actions need to be kind of updated and add new resources and revised over time. So if any of you have a specialty in, flooding or other areas and might be interested in those work groups, let me know. And we're always looking for people to kind of help contribute to the evolution of the program statewide as well.
Yeah, I'll also add to that, I'll only speak for mitigation planning, but just, there are a lot of kind of routinized processes already happening in communities. And so what's really important is to get involved and engage yourself with some of those. For mitigation planning, it is very often that the individual responsible for leading that effort is wearing many, many hats. And there are a lot of requirements to kind of check the boxes off. And so inevitably, sometimes there's not enough time to really do, enough comprehensive community engagement and to really, although we place great focus on that. And yet these planning processes are happening all the time, right? So they have to be they're mandated to be updated every 5 years, but there's also annual maintenance with these plans. And so if you involve yourself with these planning processes, you can provide a lot of really useful information to community members who often don't know where to start for some of these things. They know that they have some problems. They know how they've typically been solved for in the past. Sure, we upsize this culvert, or we could buy out this property, but what other potential retrofits, or more, more creative and potentially nature-based, what other opportunities are there for risk reduction that simply might not be apparent or available to the people, to some of the clerks in these towns and villages who are responsible for representing their community. So I think it's just really important to get yourself engaged and understand what's happening in your community.
And I'll just add one more little note. Dazzle had brought up earlier that climate smart communities is part of a national network of these. And so one of the ones to think about, there's one in Massachusetts, but one that's right across the river for many people in New York City is a Sustainable New Jersey. I'm going to put a little link in the chat provided by my colleague Medea, who said, provided this to us, but there's a similar program. So there's programs in all of our communities we've been looking into and see about how we can participate. So look for those where you can. If we're good on that one, let me go to the next question. It has often been said that resilience is greater in a community that has strong, established, and mutually helpful relationships. This past year, in terms of COVID-19 and in terms of racism and justice issues, for instance, this has really tested our relationships in a lot of our communities globally. How can we do more to get the right stakeholders to the table to help build better community resilience? Maybe Dazzle, you could start us off again with that.
Sure, I'd be happy to. I mean, I think that it is complex, and it's going to be different for each community. So I think one of the places that is one place to start is to actually learn about the demographics of your own community. There are great information available online via the U.S. Census, but also I have actually found Cornell's Program on Applied Demographics, or PAD, the Cornell PAD program, packages information kind of in a way that's accessible by municipality in New York State that I found really useful. And so that's just kind of one way in to sort of get a sense of what are the demographics, what is the income distribution in your community, and start to get a sense of at least, in planning efforts, being able to get an idea of who's missing, who is not at this table, whose voice are we not hearing as part of these planning and relationship building exercises. That's an incomplete view, and they use, odd categories and group certain groups of people together that, have very different identities, but that's at least one place to start. And again, I would emphasize learning about your community and learning about what other organizations exist in your community that advocate for the needs of certain people, and get to know them. Again, I feel like, as Erik said in the phrasing of this question, the concept of social resilience and social coherence is really fundamental. There's been studies that have shown that after a disaster, it's not the communities with the most money or the most education that survive well. It's communities with the most social coherence, where you have neighbors taking care of each other and looking out for each other, being those, in a sense, a first responder, and having a strong social network. So I think kind of framing efforts to correct systemic racism and help out historically marginalized communities and get them at the table can also be framed as this is good for everybody. And the other thing that I think is often overlooked in these local kind of efforts to build resilience is good facilitation. Actually having someone at meetings and during planning efforts where it is their role to help resolve conflicts and help build consensus and, build those bridges and help people talk to each other that maybe historically have really been at odds to each other. And this is often a challenge. You'll see funders stepping up to the plate to fund some big flashy, infrastructure project, but they may be less willing to fund someone who's going to help build those relationships and facilitate those that kind of planning work and bringing new voices to the table. So I think that's important to recognize. And then there's some practical things of, if you're interested in engaging with some planning processes, there's simple things you can consider of offer different kinds of engagements, different times of day, offer food, offer childcare, go to where the people already are in the community and ask them, develop good surveys that are fun to do. In the city of Albany, they had an effort of some people just simply grabbing clipboards and having a set of questions and walking around neighborhoods that were affected by certain issues and trying to get their input about what they wanted and what kind of future they wanted to see for themselves and their communities. And I think, look at different models. There's an effort by an organization called Groundwork Hudson Valley that's called Climate Safe Neighborhoods, which is, again, kind of working with this concept of your neighbors are your best resource in the face of some of these really major hazardous weather that's happening more intensely and more often. So there's some initial thoughts, very incomplete thoughts on my part. I know that I think Karina wanted to weigh in on this topic as well.
Nick, you go ahead.
I was just going to add two small
Great.
things. One is, if it's possible when you're writing RFPs, pay people for community engagement, because oftentimes our community organizations are the ones who are stretched the most thin by issues of racism or issues of COVID, and valuing their time like we hope to have our time valued, as architects and engineers is incredibly important. And I think the other thing is just to make sure that you're showing that you're going to have a community engagement over time, that it's not a one-off kind of activity, and then it takes multiple years to actually build relationships within communities and for people to trust you, because when you do things as a one-by-one basis, a lot of times people feel kind of used by that process. But if you say, I'm here, I'm volunteering, I'm working on these things, and I'm not going anywhere, really neat things can come out of that. So sorry, Karina, I didn't.
No, that's great. Absolutely. And I think the only thing I'll add to that is that, there are some challenges with programs where some of this inequity is kind of built in to the system, right? So for instance, our funding streams require that projects be cost effective. And so, not only does that require a lot of resources to identify and quantify the benefits versus the costs of a project, but also it really inherently puts a value on buildings, right? Beyond that, it doesn't really take into consideration the services and the population served always by those buildings and the community at risk. And so engaging with that work and with that effort and trying to, really just face it head on, and understanding that, the toolkit that we have to use for benefit cost analysis will show you that a home, valued at $500,000 is it is more cost effective to retrofit that home than it is to retrofit a very low cost home, right? Because the costs just don't outweigh the benefits there. And so what is that saying about the value that we're placing on the people inside of that home and that live in that community? So I think just addressing those kind of inequities that are built into some of these systems with good reason, but that need to be overcome, and their challenges of how do we assist and how do we provide the data that's required to quantify some of these things, to fit into the metrics that we are forced to use sometimes in these federally funded programs. So just kind of constantly needs to be a talking point.
Right.
I'll add a couple other kind of quick thoughts if I might. Is that all right?
Please do.
Thanks, Erik. The other thing I just wanted to emphasize is I've seen situations where communities have really recognized the difference between like developing a plan, developing a proposal, and then putting it in front of stakeholders that weren't involved in that process and saying, do you like this or do you not like this? Rather than kind of other situations that I've seen that I think are more effective, where the communities that they're looking to engage and the populations that may have been historically marginalized are part of designing the engagement itself, or part of designing the projects itself, and kind of inviting them in at an early stage. I think that's a really important distinction. And then I think, as Karina emphasized, to really acknowledge the historic inequities that are built into the system, and just know that that exists there from the beginning, and do your best to be mindful of it and take the time, as Nick is saying, to develop those relationships and become aware of that, and recognize that, climate change And environmentalism in general has its own history of racism and various kind of furthering various inequities. And there's a way in which a lot of white people are kind of coming to terms with this as an existential threat and kind of waking up and feeling a lot of fear. But there's been other parts of American society who have had existential threats that they've lived with for hundreds of years, slavery, for example. So I think that there's a lot to be learned from kind of other populations that may not be kind of part of the environmental movement or the climate movement, but that through bringing them to the table, we can look at how their cultures have built resilience and learn from them and kind of build up, a bigger umbrella and see a way forward for both reversing climate change and protecting our communities from these great threatening, more intense climate hazards, and also using it as a process by which you solve and resolve and correct past inequities. That's the great ambition of New York State's Climate Act anyway, and we're fumbling our way towards that. And so I hope you all are following that process and let us know whether or not we're doing it well. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Dazzle. So let's move on to another question, because I think it feeds into some of these things. Because one of the things that you brought up, Dazzle, is the need for good facilitators and people that can make sure they're being mindful of this. So the next kind of question, I think, hits right at that. Some here, of course, are planners or community members or architects and engineers who are often put in those positions of doing that. So do you as a panel have any suggestions on how these kind of folks that normally might find themselves in those roles, can become more involved in mitigation planning and adaptation measures going on right where they work and live? Maybe Tim, you could take this initially.
Sure, and there's some overlap here with my three colleagues that have already been speaking on an issue, and it sort of definitely dovetails into this question. And without maybe what I'll do is sort of double down on a few of the key points that I think have been mentioned, and facilitators is one of them, absolutely. And Nick commented on not having programs that are one-offs, having, basically having some repeat programming where people can find you because they hear about it too late and so on. But I guess to break it down, it's about relationship building, and Dazzle introduced that as well. And you have to go to the place where the people are. That's the most effective way. Design professional organizations are getting much more involved in doing that sort of grassroots planning, serving as facilitators, because there's nothing more effective than putting those people in a room together and giving them a little lunch and telling them you're going to be here all day and nobody can leave until you come up with a plan. And that's the really effective thing, putting people at a table who wouldn't normally sit at that table together. And that's the kind of facilitation that really is effective. And we've got great examples of it after Sandy here in Staten Island. There's a program called Staten Island Imagines, which is, you can find it online, SI Imagines. New York Rising was the governor's program that came out after Sandy, and that put all different people from the community together, and each county in the state had their own committee. One thing that New York City has, it has a program called 197A plan, and what that is, it's a mechanism that the city has in place where a community can make its own plan for itself. And you'd say, wow, that's amazing. That must be happening all the time. Well, it's only happened 13 times since the 1990s because it's such a task to do, and there's expense and there's so on. And I remember the Municipal Art Society in the 1990s issued a report to the governor's office that said, to the mayor's office, pardon me, that said that community boards should be getting at least $100,000 a year so that they can have the ability to sponsor a 197A plan and so on. So this has been around for a long time. And I'm just using New York City as an example because I know it so personally. But it's really about facilitating it, going to where, the heart of the neighborhood, getting those people to participate and mixing it up. And I think that that's really the best way to get results. But it just doesn't happen organically because there's just so many impediments to it. And so I think those that have the ability to facilitate have to get out there and shake the tree a bit and get it started.
Thanks, Tim. Maybe another question here, and it might help us continue to go down this road a little bit, is what are some ways that you as a panelist have seen architects, engineers, planners, and constructors aid in the mitigation and adaptation efforts that you've been a part of? Is it by focusing really narrowly on their discipline, or does it require a much more multi or interdisciplinary approach? Maybe Nick, you could speak to that a little bit.
So thanks, Eric. I mean, as an academic, I certainly can walk through all of the different definitions of multi, trans, intra-disciplinary kind of stuff. You know, I think one of the things that we just have to recognize is, and I think what Tim and some of the others have always talked about is, if you want to facilitate these processes, if you want it to have it be effective as an architect or engineer, the question you always have to ask is who's not at the table that needs to be here? And to make sure that they are truly being involved in the process. I think as architect, as an architect, we are oftentimes comfortable about doing our work and then passing it off to a consultant, but having a much more authentic dialogue, about each of these different steps and making sure that we're not designing in a vulnerability as part of our process is really, really critical. And that only comes from having conversations. I think, unless you kind of get your butt handed to you in a community meeting or in a meeting with a team member, you're probably not doing something right, because you should challenge these different assumptions that you have, because it's a very tricky set of issues that we're working with. Architects are not by training, and certainly engineers are not by training social scientists, so they oftentimes don't understand some of the issues of social cohesion or what can build those in the community. And at the same time, on the planning side, right, oftentimes aren't getting into the technical issues or understanding some of those limitations. And so making sure you have that representation is so critical. And so now that I'm, in architecture and planning, I kind of hate myself all the time, but it is useful to be able to have some of these other conversations. So that was a joke, so sorry.
I'll just, add to that, Nick, by saying that, again, getting involved at the time of these processes is really important. So for instance, at the time, during a mitigation planning process, communities have gone through all of this effort for identifying their risks and their vulnerabilities and identifying their capabilities. And then we're at the mitigation strategy portion, right? And we will often sit with like I said, an individual from a clerk from town hall or somebody else, oftentimes it could be someone from soil and water or the highway department that has some really good information. But this is the time when we are trying to develop more comprehensive solutions that can then lead to implementation. And when the time for implementation comes, when there is funding available and money available and applications need to be put in, it's too late to develop the projects, right? And so we're sitting during these planning processes trying to come up with good strategies and tangible actions for risk reduction. And we simply don't have people at the table who can offer technical expertise and who can offer some even back of the envelope kind of cost estimation and some, ideas about what's worked in the past, what new technologies and approaches are being implemented now that might not be, obvious to your every person. And so really having those people involved in these meetings where those solutions are being developed and then documented is massive, is huge. And we try to bring some from the state. We try to bring engineers with us for these programs. We try to encourage local community members to engage as well. But I really encourage you to offer that time. It can sometimes be a very short, 1 to 2 hour meeting for an entire county and can provide invaluable resources.
Great. Maybe that should take one more question. There's a couple audience ones I think that we want to kind of bring into the conversation here after I do this one. But when we think about resilience, we often think about this if we're architects, engineers, contractors, planners, in terms of infrastructure and buildings. I think we've talked a little bit at it, but I think there's a little bit more to explore. What else do you think we should be considering when we help build resilience? Maybe Amanda, you could speak about that.
Yeah, sure, I can start us off. So one thing I think to think about is, maybe from the land use planning perspective, sometimes thinking about not just the building or infrastructure itself, but how that fits into the community as a whole will help with resilience from a larger perspective. And then I think, a really big one is not just the building, but the occupants of the building. And I think we've, Karina touched on this, and I think others have too earlier, that the reason we're worrying about resilience of our infrastructure is because of the people who use it. So it's really important to think about how to make the occupants and users of the buildings and infrastructure safe and resilient. So, just as an example is for heat waves and things like that, whether there might be materials issues with high heat, but there's also even bigger issues with the occupants of buildings. So when we're designing this infrastructure, think about how to design safety features and resilience into them that help with the safety of the people as well.
Great. Any other thoughts on that from the panel? Tim,
Yeah, I would just say it's to sort of take it a step further, even from Amanda's thoughts. I mean, it's quality of life, right? It's designing for quality of life, access to open space, access to food, reduced reliance on cars, more localized access to emergency services, and microgrids, things like that. And just some things to think about. I think the design community should be thinking about those things all the time, even if you're doing a one-family house. I mean, we really need to be thinking much broader about the community, as Amanda says.
So we're getting some great questions in the chat, and one of them I think is an interesting one. And it's also in a Q&A, and I know people are maybe typing in responses as well. Is, how do we measure this resilience? It seems like sometimes we say resilience, it's a verb, there's things to do, it's a noun, it's stuff, but how do we measure it? And maybe some of the panelists could speak a little bit to that, because there's a couple questions both in the chat and in the question and answer that come in around that. And so I don't know who might want to take the first hit at that or first swing at the bat, but how do we measure resilience? How do we put values to this so we can understand how we can improve the performance over time?
So
I'd say this is a tough question and a really important question. Nick, is that all right? I'll be
Sure,
very
go.
brief, because basically I'm going to say it's hard to answer. Or that at least I'm an advocate for not trying to answer it for everybody in the same way. I put a link in the chat for a website that was developed by Susie Mosier and her team. And she lays out a sort of a process and kind of has that recognition that each community is different. And you have different scales and different values, but she lays out a framework for kind of recognizing that there are different aspects to resilience, and climate resilience is one thing, and sort of social resilience is another thing. Financial resilience is another thing. There are kind of the different ways of slicing and dicing this and thinking about it. And that it's crucial through kind of a planning and a community engagement process to incorporate questions about what matters to you, what are the values of your community, what do people care about locally, what is it that they want to protect, and what is it that they feel threatened by climate change, and how can you measure that and kind of measure the improvement or the protection or the regeneration of that asset over time, and kind of build that into the kind of discussion and the planning process so that it is an ongoing engagement with these living systems that we rely on, and kind of defining those metrics for your own community. I think there are some systems where it is more standardized and uniform, and that can be valuable too, but I like the kind of approach of the Susie Mosier and her team that kind of recognizes it may be unique to a particular place, and to kind of get engaged with those ideas and not necessarily expect a set of external experts to say, well, you should do this, but start with that question of who are you, what do you care about, you and your neighbors and your community, what's important to you to track and to follow. There's some thoughts, please, but I'd love to hear from Nick.
No, and I was actually going to say almost exactly the same thing. I mean, it really depends up front. And I think one of the things that I dropped in the chat window was, as part of this work we did with NYSERDA, looking at some of these different rating systems that were out there, we actually found at the time of publication a year or two ago that there were 18 different systems that were out in the market. And rather than saying that one is better than the other, I think it reflects different ways that institutions are approaching the concept of resilience. And when I get asked the question, well, which one of these things should I use? Should I use RELi? Should I use peer? Should I use these other things? It really comes down to what can you sustain as a community? What best reflects the values that you're bringing to these projects? Because the resilience is not a one-off kind of thing. It's something that requires maintenance and it requires work, over the long term. And so if people are bought into the process and everybody, in your community is kind of bought into that process, that's the kind of right approaches and the right credits, to begin to go after. Certainly there are more technical aspects. You can talk to an engineer and an architect about designing buildings for wind loads or snow loads or other things like that. But this broader concept of resilience really does require both kind of an engineering side and also a soft social science side.
Yeah, Nick, I'll also add to that. So the resilience, metrics certainly, right, are not standard across programs, I don't think. And I'll speak a little bit about the benefit cost analysis. And that is that historically, right, in the past, we've had to look at only traditional benefits for evaluating the cost effectiveness of a project. And so we're looking at, loss of function in the future, loss avoidance. So at what point in time and how will this building incur damage? Might this building incur damage, and what could the extent of that damage be? And then we kind of calculate that out using a toolkit, using databases, Excel sheet kind of algorithms. And what we used to do is that the environmental and social and benefits could not be used until you met the threshold of a 0.75 with traditional benefits. So just risk to tangible, people and property. And what they did in recent policy changes was remove that threshold. So we can now actually use a large base of information to quantify value of projects that we previously couldn't. For instance, if you are acquiring a property on the coastline and then also want to restore some of that floodplain, or not on the coast, but maybe in a riverine area, and want to restore some of that floodplain. Once you remove the project, the restoration of that floodplain typically wouldn't have been cost effective because you've already removed the building that is providing all of these benefits. Now, as a comprehensive solution, if there is water quality benefits or social benefits to the community, we can use those in our analyses. So that's just one kind of piece that's at least been a slight improvement. And I believe that FEMA is starting to respond, especially with the change in administration, is starting to respond much more positively to it, even more, more of an evolution of quantifying those benefits. So for instance, the services that a building provide, the community services. We typically could look at the utility services, right? What is the population served of critical functions, medical services, emergency services, but we couldn't look to say, what kind of community benefit does this have to, a large population of the youth who may come to this community, and how do you start to quantify those metrics? And I don't think we don't have a consistent system for that, but FEMA is at least becoming much more, willing to accept those kinds of analyses more comprehensively and holistically.
And I'll just say, because some people have asked some questions about rating systems like RELi and peer, and each of them have taken a different take. For instance, peer obviously is for the power grid. And so obviously there's some different thoughts about what are important. So what are quantitative measures and versus quantitative measures that have to be thought about, qualitative measures that have to be thought about. And so each of them take a different tact, if you will, to just like each community has to figure them out, and they're going to take a different tact. So while we could spend quite a bit of time and talking about each of them, and actually each has several different ways that they address resilience, they are approaching them from different approaches. So you have to really think about where you're trying to go and what you're trying to do. Another kind of question is kind of out here in this is kind of a question around thinking about where we can get money to do stuff. And so Dazzle, you brought up the Climate Smart Communities Grant Program. I think you brought up some planning grant opportunities for communities, Karina. Are there other places that we can help communities with finding support to engage in mitigation efforts as they engage these tools or utilize these tools, get consultants on board to help them? What are some maybe other ways that we may be able to share? Is there any that's kind of come up a couple times in some of the questions? Anything that the panelists might be able to provide in that light?
I mean, I'll throw one thing out there, which is in addition to kind of typical grant funding or looking for other opportunities, like one really good skill set that architects, planners, and engineers can have is if they volunteer with community organizations, they can help to visualize ideas that may be beneficial to helping a community be more resilient. And then with that information, actually go to granting agencies or to foundations to make that happen. And, in a lot of cases, being able to see this and getting community buy-in is a very powerful thing to have before you actually think about, going to try to find funding to support something.
Anybody else? I was just going to say one of the things that we really need to start thinking about are those members that are emerging professionals. A lot of these emerging professionals are ingrained in their communities. They're looking for ways to quote unquote get ahead. And these are great opportunities for them to engage their community and also think about how they can develop their skill sets better for some of these things. I would really encourage you to think about how we can leverage those that are, in our younger professionals in different ways. Dazzle, are you going to say something?
Yeah, I just wanted to offer, in the chat, I just sent a link that is focused on the Hudson River Estuary within New York State, but it has links to programs that are federal programs and other New York State programs that apply kind of outside of that region. And it is a bit outdated. You'll notice that the kind of fact sheet is dated for 2019, but it is oriented towards funding sources and assistance with, particularly with a climate change adaptation type frame. And that's a resource that team at the DEC's Hudson River Estuary program assembles each year. So that may be a useful source of information about funding programs. And within the Hudson River Estuary, if you are somewhere along the Hudson River or within that watershed region, there are some other programs, grants directly from the DEC's Hudson River Estuary program. And then they have some really interesting programs, a set of funding that's related to a program that's called Climate Adaptive Design, or CAD Studio. That's a partnership with Cornell, and that's a pretty extraordinary program that they've been kind of expanding over time, that offers funding for municipalities to partner with landscape architect students and professors at Cornell to kind of reimagine their waterfronts as places that will be resilient to flooding and to extreme weather, and kind of support better ecosystem health and community recreation and a closer relationship with the waterfronts. So those are a couple of resources that come to mind for me as well.
Erik, I want to offer to, I'm a little hesitant to, but I'm going to put it in this link anyway. We're moving this over to a new platform, so it is what it is here. But this is a site on our state hazard mitigation plan, our current web-based state hazard mitigation plan, that kind of lists out, some of the more common funding sources for mitigation related activities. But then at the bottom, there is a long kind of table here that each of these pieces expand to show multiple different funding opportunities in the state, and those can be sorted by the agency or the hazard that they address, and that would just be a natural weather hazard that they address, or the location, whether that's administered locally, statewide, or at a county or regional level. And So this is a good place to start. As I said, we are reformatting this and moving to a new platform, but there is kind of a list here that might be of some interest.
Just throw out there
Great.
too that there are, maybe I may be wrong about this, but there might be more sources out there that are geared more toward energy reduction or greenhouse gas mitigation than adaptation and resilience. But one thing to keep in mind is that a lot of those measures have resilience and adaptation co-benefits as well, and vice versa. So if there are resilience measures that you want to put into place, you still might be able to get funding through some more greenhouse gas reduction centered funding sources if they have those same co-benefits. So just a brief example are passive house type strategies that definitely have energy and emissions reduction benefits, but they also do then contribute to resilience of the occupants during an outage or something like that. So keep in mind that there are those co-benefits out there as well.
Great. Well, thank you all on the panel for a lively discussion this afternoon. For the purposes of those that are getting their PDHs or their AIA learning units or what have you, we have a few things we just want to kind of check on our learning today to make sure we can answer. So those in the audience, as you read through these questions, we're going to go through them one at a time. Please put your answers in the chat or be prepared on a exit survey if you want to get credit for this to be able to answer these questions. So we'll do that. The first question or check on learning for us, all of us, and we've hopefully answered this well for you today, is how does the New York State Climate Smart Communities program help communities become more resilient to climate change? Dazzle, I think this is really a question for you.
Absolutely. So in my mind, there's basically sort of three fundamental things. One is free online guidance, just information, resources, tools, information about climate change, mitigating emissions, and reducing vulnerability to climate change, that adaptation side. So number one is this information. Number two is that technical assistance from regional coordinators, people who are there to answer questions and to provide support. Currently, that set of people is the NYSERDA funded Clean Energy Communities Coordinators, but I am pleased to say that soon, hopefully DEC will also be issuing an RFP for what we'll call climate leadership coordinators. I know this isn't the right time in this presentation to be talking new information, but that is just realizing that's coming to mind. So free information available online, assistance from human beings who you can meet with and call with to assist with projects. And then there is the straight up funding programs, the grants and rebates that the DEC's Office of Climate Change offers to municipalities for climate projects and electric vehicle related projects.
Great, thank you. So we all have that answer now, so you should be all good to go to answer the post question. So the next question is, what is a tool that can be used, I'm sorry, the spelling on this wasn't exactly right, to mitigate the effects of climate change in a New York State community? Maybe Karina, you might have an answer for this one. What do you think?
Well, certainly our planning tools at mitigateny.org can be a resource, and just FYI, we're putting the county name before that URL will get you to the county plan. So for instance, the Sullivan County plan that I mentioned would be sullivan.mitigateny.org. But I think Nick has quite a few others. I mean, that really only scratches the surface on hazard mitigation planning, but to really, talk about some of the other resources, I think that the tools, you might want to reference them. Nick, yours.
Yep, sure. So some of the ones that I talked about in my presentation on the Adapting Buildings website are the Climate Resilience Strategies document, and then a whole series of other reports that contain information about hazards, et cetera. And also, Amanda talked about some of the things like the IDF curves that are helpful. And I don't know, Amanda, if you want to throw a couple in there as well that NYSERDA has developed, or if I just stole your thunder.
No, that's all right. I got a couple others. So certainly IDF curves and the buildings that Nick talked about. There's also things like the Hudson River Future Flood Mapper that will let you look at where future flooding from sea level rise and storms might happen. If you're interested in extreme heat and vulnerable populations, there's the social vulnerability index that we developed with DOH as well.
Great. Well, that's kind of going to bring us to the third question. Where is there a great warehouse of information available on climate change effects in New York State? Maybe Amanda, you could hit on that one.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the state climate change science clearinghouse is hopes to do that. It's a really good repository of lots of different climate science related information that's specific to New York State.
Great, thank you. Question 4, what is a great tool that is expected to be released in the summer of 2021 to aid architects in preparing and responding to disasters? Tim, is that a question for you?
I don't know. That's a tough one, Eric. I don't know. Let's see. Yeah, it's the Disaster Assistance Handbook. It's the AIA, New York State Disaster Assistance Handbook. It's aiding architects, but through that, I think the benefit, of course, is the end user of our buildings and the community as a whole. So we're looking at it as that. That's our audience for this book. So I hope everyone has a chance to check that out. And by the way, if you haven't already, the resources that have been put up in the chat are terrific, that the panelists have been adding there. So please do check those out.
So thanks for that, Tim. And question 5 is, I'll help answer it, but I think it actually affects some of this. So what are some rating systems that are available to help your community build resilience? I've already mentioned RELi, PEER, LEAD, and Sustainable Sites Initiative that are available through USGBC. But Dazzle's been explaining the Climate Smart Communities rating system, and there's a Clean Energy Communities rating system from NYSERDA. So these are other ones, as well as Sustainable New Jersey, which was brought up earlier for New Jersey, and this network of other ones at state level. So there are a series of them that are out there. And Nick has put a couple times in the chat an article that he wrote that evaluates a number of these rating systems. You can get onto those. Please take advantage of that. It's a great article he wrote back in 2019. It was published in 2019. Probably wrote it before then, but as they all go. But make sure you grab a copy of that. That's a very useful article for understanding that. And it includes these rating systems from the USGBC. As we think about the next stage in this, we do have 2 more sessions, as I mentioned at the beginning of this, one in May, where we're looking at the future of military engineering innovation for resilience. Again, it'll be CEUs will be available for this. It'll be online. You can see the time on this. We also have one on the science of storm surge risk reduction. What's going on that one? You can see some of the great speakers we have lined up for that already. So please, reach out to us. Medea Valeri is here to make sure you get registered. Take advantage of that. You can reach out to her, as well as just reach out to our webpage and get more information in regards to what's going on. And then last but not least, we want to thank you for being here today. Really appreciate that opportunity. We asked the panelists to stand by for a little bit as everybody leaves. We got one last thing to do as we close out. Otherwise, thank you very much. If you have other things you need, let us know, and we'll go from there. So please register for the next sessions, and we'll see you in May. Thank you very much, folks. So the attendees leave here. We just need to get a quick photo of all of us before we leave out. So